he was away for 5 months. Because if you spend 4 or 5 weeks in each direction by sea, as he did, you don't go for a 1-week conference. Next month, I'm going to give a speech in Washington. I'll be out of the country for 4 days. That kind of speed of travel is something which even our parents knew nothing of. We're a country also which is relatively free of corruption. We're a country where no matter who you are, if you break the law, you'll get charged. We were talking a moment ago about the fact that John Banks was charged for an electoral expense issue when he was the Minister of the Crown. Helen Clark, driving rapidly through Canterbury, at least had a driver charged. She wasn't personally charged, she probably should have been. But even the Prime Minister's driver was charged with breaking the law. I have to say that I got a speeding ticket myself 10 days ago. The driver looked at the police officer looked at my driver's license, recognised me, and said that'll be $80 and 20 demerit points, which I must say I was very sad about. Our daughters can do anything too. Okay, not quite anything, but the reality is, compared with many parts of the world, our daughters have most opportunities open to them. You go to many countries in the world, our daughters would have no opportunities at all. We speak English. We take that for granted. But English is the international language. When I was governor of the Reserve Bank, we used to have meetings of governors of central banks from Mongolia in the north, right away through East Asia, Taiwan, China, Japan, Southeast Asia, New Zealand, Australia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Iran. At every meeting, we spoke in English, and no translation facilities were provided. Every single governor could speak English except one, and he brought his own translator. When a German aircraft lands in Frankfurt, Germany, the German pilot would talk to ground control in English. The European Central Bank, based in Frankfurt, the only member of the Eurozone, which speaks English, is Ireland. Every meeting is conducted in English. So we have an enormous advantage arising from that. So we're very lucky. But 5 things worry me, and that's what I said, or are we a lucky country? The first is that our trend rate of per capita income is among the slowest in the world. We're growing right now at 3% roughly, a little less, a little more perhaps, but per capita growth is actually very low indeed. Aggregate growth doesn't look too bad because population is growing quite quickly as a consequence of immigration and returning New Zealanders. Per capita growth is very low indeed, and has been for quite some time. When the government came to power in 2008, one of their campaign pledges was to catch Australian income levels by 2025, and I was privileged to be appointed the chairman of the so-called 2025 task force. And the challenge was, how do we narrow a gap which was roughly a third Australian income, so there was roughly a third higher than those in New Zealand, within a 17-year period from 2008 to 2025. 8 years later, the gap has not changed. Australian incomes are still about 1/3 higher per head than ours are. And that has to be quite a serious concern. Because what we saw before the Australian commodity boom bust was New Zealanders moving across the Tasman in very large numbers. Not happening right now, but you can be fairly confident that when the Australian economy picks up again, we face the same threat, losing some of our best and most innovative people across the Tasman. Second worry I have is our long-term fiscal position. I mentioned that the government ran a budget surplus in the year to June last year, may even make a budget surplus again in the year we're just about to finish, end of June. But the consequence of the fact that the population is on average getting older is that we face a very substantial increase in government spending on New Zealand super on healthcare, and on retirement aged care. That will certainly explode over the next 20 years. And sadly, the government has shown absolutely no willingness at all to deal with that issue. No one wants to touch it. I can't fully understand that, because clearly it wouldn't affect anyone who's already over 65. Government couldn't do that. It couldn't even change the system which might affect someone who's over, say, 60 or 55. You've got to give people plenty of time to plan for a change. But even with plenty of time, the government has shown itself unwilling to face that. The third issue which worries me, I mentioned that our balance of payments deficit is a bit smaller at the moment than it's been historically. In other words, we're earning more in exports of goods and indeed services, tourism, export of education and so on than previously. But we're still spending more overseas every year than we earn overseas. Does anyone know when we last earned more overseas than we're spending overseas? Anyone know that? Yep.
Probably online retailers, you know.
Sorry?
We're buying a lot of stuff online from overseas.
No, but well, that's true. But we've been spending more than we've been earning overseas for quite a long time. The last time we earned a surplus, and we earned more than we spent overseas, was 1974.
Oh, really?
1974. More than 40 years ago. And of course, if you spend more than you earn, by definition, you accumulate debt. That's the same as whatever we do individually. As a consequence of that, our so-called net external liabilities as a country are among the highest in the developed world. That's partly government debt. The government doesn't owe any foreign exchange debt. That was all paid off. But when the government issues New Zealand dollar bonds and foreigners buy it, that's an obligation to foreigners. And of course, we have borrowing by companies, we have borrowing by banks. A lot of banks borrow overseas because they've got much more demand to borrow from banks than they have New Zealanders inclined to save with banks, so they borrow offshore. And that is all funding the tendency to spend more than we earn. The fourth thing which worries me is the housing issue. Now, I know that in Auckland, everybody loves the housing crisis because our houses are all going up in value, and we pretend that we're getting wealthier and wealthier. But I think it's the biggest single crisis facing the country right now. And I hear people say, oh, we've always had to save long to buy a house. That is baloney. That is baloney. Yes, we saved hard. But until about the early 90s, the median house price in Auckland was about 3 times the median household income. It's now 10 times. It's now 10 times. We have some of the most expensive housing in the world relative to incomes. And it's a major source of the social problems we hear talking about. Overcrowding in housing, the ill health arising from that overcrowding, people who haven't got much money left over after they've paid the mortgage or paid the rent. It's a serious social problem. It may even be a serious problem for the banking sector. You've got Graham Wheeler, the governor, worried about the effect on the banks if there were a sudden reduction in house prices back to something more like normality. And we all know now what the cause of the problem is. I was on Paul Henry this morning, as I am every couple of weeks, and one of the subjects we discussed was Peter Dunn's call for a conference on the housing crisis. And I had to say, look, I think Peter Dunn is making a desperate attempt to get into the frame on this debate. It's now clearly understood between Labour and National what is causing the housing crisis. And Phil Twyford, the Labour Party housing spokesman, has got it absolutely nailed. He understands it completely. The problem is essentially the fact that the Auckland Council, and before the Auckland Council, the Auckland Regional Council, put a ring around the city and said you cannot build a house outside that ring. Arthur Grimes, who for a number of years was the chairman of the Reserve Bank Board, did a study in Auckland, and he said land prices inside that border, depending on the border you are, but are roughly 10 times the price of land just outside the border. People complain that people only build expensive houses on the land, but of course they build expensive houses on the land. If you paid $500,000 for a tiny sliver of land, you're not going to put a $100,000 house on it. But even if you did, it would still cost $600,000. People are not buying houses, they're buying tiny pieces of land. And it's having enormously serious social consequences, but also economic consequences. I mentioned the banks are borrowing big time overseas to fund our insatiable demand for mortgages. People worry that first home buyers can't get onto the first rung of the ladder. The metaphor implies that house prices always go up. So you've got to get on the bottom rung so you can ride up the ladder, or climb up the ladder. If house prices were to fall 50%, as they could do, getting a first home buyer into a house is the last thing you want to do. Would wipe them out financially. So it's a serious issue. And the final thing which worries me, and perhaps it won't surprise you unduly given my history, I worry about our continual drift to creating two distinct peoples in New Zealand, those who have a Maori ancestor and those who don't. I think that is an absolutely retrograde direction, and it will lead us into a great deal of trouble. I think it is clear that in 1840, Governor Hobson thought that he was inviting Maori chiefs to become one people with the colonists. That's what he said, as each Maori chief signed the treaty. We are now one people. But we're behaving as if there are two people. Behaving as if somehow Maori created a partnership with the Crown. Now that has to be an absolute nonsense. The first article of the treaty said that we cede sovereignty to the Crown. There can't be a partnership between the Crown and anyone else. I think people say we should get rid of the treaty. On the contrary, I don't agree with that. I think the treaty was a fantastic document. Fantastic document. Article 3 of the treaty said, you now have the rights and privileges of British subjects. For 1840, that was an extraordinary thing to say. It didn't happen in Australia. The colonists in Australia went out and shot Aborigines in significant numbers. It didn't happen in North America. It happened in New Zealand. And I think that is a fantastic basis for nationhood. So yes, we are lucky to live in this country. I think there's an awful lot of things going forward, and I'm very glad indeed that I was born here and brought up here. But we certainly have some major challenges. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that there will be some questions, so Don has kindly offered to answer those questions. Or try. If he can't, he'll make it up. Because really he's a politician. So please, questions. Glenn.
Brash, housing, I agree with you entirely. Expand the perimeter for Auckland. Tell me who's going to pay for the land, because the people that own that land know they're sitting on a little gold mine. Once it's owned and that, who's going to pay for all the infrastructure? By the time you put in roading and power and sewerage and all those sort of things, how do we ever get affordable housing out of that?
Well, first of all, people who land bank now only land bank because of the boundary. If there were no boundary, land banking makes no sense at all.
But they have. They've done that.
They have. Let's basically take away the boundary now. Land which may be worth $5 million a hectare inside the boundary suddenly becomes worth $500,000 a hectare.
But they're not going to sell it for that.
Well, okay, they can't sell it. You know, if you eliminate you don't push it out half a mile, you eliminate it. So if you want to drive, I drive up the Northern Motorway occasionally between a Tia Valley Road exit and the Silverton exit, 11 kilometres, no exits at all, and it's scrub. It's bush. It's not high quality horticultural land. It's just unoccupied land. Now imagine if you said you could build anywhere you like in that area. Okay, so you reduce the price of land radically. The question you ask is, how do you finance the infrastructure? Again, I think Phil Twyford has got it absolutely on the nail. You allow the developer who's bought 300 acres or whatever it is, or hectares, to issue bonds, so-called, in the US they call them metropolitan, municipal utility district bonds, which are funded by rates on that bit of land. So the people buying still have to pay for the infrastructure. Nothing wrong with that. They should do. The rest of us shouldn't be paying for it. But they don't pay for it up front in the value of the land, which is what they're doing now. I mean, the developers have to put up the full cost of the infrastructure before Auckland Council will let them develop. If they could fund that over 30 years, well, you add it to your mortgage and it's a small increase in the rates every year, but the rates are confined to that block of land.
Right.
And I think that would work perfectly. It works in Houston perfectly.
So I don't have to pay.
Sorry?
I don't have to
No,
pay for it.
well, you shouldn't have to pay. That's certainly right.
Gavin? And then Matthew.
I like when you said that, because when I first bought my first plot of land, which was in Browns Bay, and it was part of the whole of the estate, that's exactly how it was bought. You had the rates, you had to pay extra for the drainage, you had to pay extra for the sewer, and you had to pay extra for the library. And no one else paid any more for it. That was the area, and that's where you wanted to live, that's what you paid. And my father-in-law said to me, you got no balls, you've got to pay $13,500 for just a piece of brown clay, because that's all they put on the land those days, Mr. Fletcher did. But you had to pay for all of the infrastructure to go with it. So, yes, I don't disagree with that.
Matthew?
The aging population is a big issue in OECD countries. What's your solution for particularly New Zealand? We have a sort of aging population in the future, next 20 years. How we can eliminate this issue or sort of diffuse the situation?
Well, I mean, my view, the aging population is also associated with increasing average life expectancy. It's going up by roughly 2 years every decade. So I think we're living in a healthier way. People who used to be absolutely clapped down at 65 are no longer typically clapped down at 65. But joking aside, I mean, I'm 75. I'm still substantially employed, not doing a hard physical manual job, I have to say. I wouldn't be able to do that. But I'm still actively employed. And I think gradually we will continue to be at some kind of employment or income earning capacity longer than previously. We don't have to retire at 65, in my view. But I think we should gradually, and I mean gradually, increase that age of eligibility, as most other Western countries are doing. We're one of the, I mean, Australia's going to 67 and talking about going to 70. And there's no reason why we can't do something similar.
Then we have young unemployment sort of issue. How are we going to deal with that?
Well, the two parts of the question. If you're asking about will the fact that older people are staying in the workforce longer create more unemployment,
Yeah.
I don't accept that. I mean, that's a very common view, but if you stay longer in employment, you're earning more, you're spending more. I mean, otherwise you say, well, we fix all the unemployment completely by continuing dropping the age and everyone retire at 45, and we have no unemployment at all. I mean, that wouldn't work because people still want to buy stuff. And yes, the fact that your boss is 65 or 66 or 67 might mean that that particular job isn't available to someone coming through. That's a possibility. But in principle, it shouldn't generate additional unemployment simply because older people continue in the workforce. Now, the more general question, the more difficult question, I think, is what do we do with the fact that so many jobs which we've taken for granted as being done by humans and now not being done by humans? And shortly that'll be much more clear. I mean, driverless cars, driverless trucks, things that we assumed would have to be done by human beings may well be done by robots or other electronic or mechanized ways. That's a more difficult challenge, and I'm not sure the answer to that question.
Joseph, and then Rob.
you've kind of started to answer the question that I wanted to ask, and that was, you attend a lot of global fora and so on. What do you see as being the major global issue or issues at the moment? And obviously, globalisation is one that would be relevant.
Middle of last week, I attended a fascinating lecture by a guy called Neil Ferguson, who some of you will know of. He's a Scottish historian, now Professor of History at Harvard, and he was in Auckland. He gave a lecture at Waipuna Lodge, I think Wednesday last week. Fascinating lecture, and he was basically talking about the outlook for the world economy. And he talked about the fact that, in his view, the world economy has finally recovered from the global financial crisis, and as of about February this year has started in some sort of realistic way to start growing again. So he was quite optimistic in one sense. But then he said there are 5 major risks. and he listed, I can't list them all now, but one of the biggest ones was Trump. What happens if Trump would become president? All bets are off. I mean, it's a scary prospect, I think. I mean, it doesn't bear thinking about. I mean, the guy who wants to build a wall in the US to Mexico, make Mexico pay for it, wants to stop importing from China, Japan, expel 11 million immigrants. I mean, this would be chaos on a gigantic scale if you were able to put it off. And looking at recent polls, you would say there's a slight, well, more than a slight risk that he might become president. The Chinese economy is also, I think, a serious risk. Huge increase in debt in China. If that bubble were to burst, we would be certainly adversely affected. So there are a number of risks out there which are quite worrying, and which the robots and electronic gizmos are certainly one of the risks. I mean, we all live by our Googles and iPhones and what have you, but there are some risks in terms of employment. Good one.
Rob, and then we'll finish with you.
Yeah, Don, given that the rest of the world is extending the eligibility age for superannuation, given that most economists think that it's right to do, and even a lot of us here, can you postulate why the National Party and the current government would not extend?
I think the answer is 2 words. Winston Peters. In 2011, I was leader of the ACT Party, foolishly, but I was leader of the ACT Party. At that election, John Key had Labour on his left and ACT on his right, both saying the age of eligibility for New Zealand super has to go up. He still didn't change. He still stuck to his commitment. It will never go up when I'm Prime Minister. It doesn't have to go up. He just needs to flag the fact that it will go up. Yes. It won't go up in this year or next year or the year after. But it ought to start going up maybe 2020. People have got enough time to sort of prepare for that change. So I don't understand why he won't do it. Bill English clearly understands the fact that it has to go up. And Bill was asked on a TV1 Q&A program a Sunday several years ago now, Minister, don't you think the age of eligibility for New Zealand super has to go up? He didn't say yes or no. He said the Prime Minister has ruled it out. He knows perfectly well it should be going up. But I think he does worry about Winston Peters. I mean, the irony is Winston Peters allegedly appeals to people mainly who are over 65. They aren't affected by change. They don't get affected at all. You can't possibly change the age of eligibility for people who are already in retirement, or indeed people who are even close to retirement. It would be quite unconscionable. But you've got to flag the fact that it will take place at some point.
I can't understand.
Most of us can't, I think, Rob.
Yeah, just keep working.
And finally, Jeff, please.
To some extent, Don, my question, the wind has been taken from my sail, you could argue, but I was likening you with the name Don and another individual with the name Donald, and the fact that your surname is Brash, and Donald Brash Trump would be an appropriate name for that individual. The worrying thing, as you've touched on it before now, is the impact on the world's economy should that beast of an ignorant man get into power, is worrying the tripe out of most of us, I think. Do you think that Hillary Clinton is more likely to take the Conservative vote and win out in the end?
My answer is inevitably coloured by wishful thinking. I mean, Hillary Clinton is so much to be preferred in my view. She's had experience of being at the White House. She knows what that's like. She's been a senator from New York for 6 years, Secretary of State for 4 years. She's had a huge amount of experience. Has she got flaws? We've all got flaws, and she has some too, I guess. But if you compare the two, it's a no-brainer, in my view. And I cannot understand that a man who has offended most women in the United States, offended most Afro-Americans in the United States, offended most Hispanics in the US, how you can possibly win the presidency having offended those 3 major voting blocs. But polls suggest they're running neck and neck. So it's scary.
As of today. Well, Max, seeing as you're a visitor, and if you keep it brief.
That's impossible.
Well, then don't speak.
That's impossible.